president of the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society. And Holly Horton, our executive director, is here. Appreciate it. And we have Pat Satterfield on our board and is here. And we have, I think that's our, Bessida is on our board, and we're very fortunate to have those people. I want to read Bessida's biography because it's a very extremely shortened version, but I want to make sure I get it right. Bessida Cauthorne White is a genealogist, a community historian, and retired attorney who is an Urbana native, has been an activist for more than 50 years. Her focus areas include African American, women's, and LGBT rights. Bessida sought nationally and regionally, is sought nationally and regionally as a speaker and event planner. She served on the board of the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia for more than 20 years and currently serves on the boards of the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society and the Library of Virginia. Bessida is the historian for Angel Visit Baptist Church in Dunsville, Virginia, and chairs the church's trustee board. Bessida is the recipient of numerous awards at the local, state, and national level. In 2020, she was named by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture as one of today's agents of change. And we are very lucky to have Bessida in our county, and we're especially thankful she's on our board. So Bessida, we look forward to hear.
Thank you, Marilyn, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored that you took the time to come and come in from the lovely, lovely weather we're having outside to join us, and so thank you so much for that. The topic for today is DNA, and that's what we're going to be talking about, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And anyway, we'll talk about all about what that means. And you know, it's got something to do with family history. And I'll just tell you a little bit about my involvement with DNA. I've been doing family history for 40 plus years, a very long time. In fact, I used to, every time there was a family reunion, I'd do a little bit of research, present something for the family reunion, and then I wouldn't do anything until the next family reunion, which was 2 years later. And then I'd do a little bit again. And eventually, after 8 or 10 years of that, I thought, well, you need to be serious about this pursuit. And you got lots of families to research. You know, you've got 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. And so there's a lot of work to do, and you really have to do it more than every 2 years. But anyway, so I've been doing family history, and this whole idea of DNA testing, you know, we've probably, many of us heard of DNA, you know, if there was a paternity suit. You know, if someone was said to be the father of a child, then the courts tested to see if that person was the child. And so that's how many of us heard of DNA. But in the 21st century, there came to be this commercial DNA that is available to just consumers, just ordinary people like us. And I think it was in 2007 that I was first aware of DNA. And at that point, it was something that we were told, and I knew little about it, despite having a degree in biology. I really didn't remember much about DNA, but we were told that, okay, men could do it, and you were testing men. But anyway, that's my history. We tested the men and the women in our family in 2007. We got some information, and what was available to the consumer at that time was actually very limited. It's not until 2012 that you are able to purchase a consumer test that gives you an idea of your entire makeup. So, several things I hope that we can come from this. And I'll throw out a lot of stuff that I know you won't remember, but if we can do nothing else today, I hope it's 2 things. I hope it's, first of all, learn how to spell genealogy. that is, it's like most of the ologies are O-L-O-G-Y, right? Well, you know how the English language is, it's not always logical. You just have to memorize it. So this ology is A-L-O-G-Y. So you see that, an introduction to genetic genealogy, Genealogy. So that's one thing. And then there's something else I really want you to learn, and we'll talk about it later, and that is that your first cousin's child is not your second cousin. And just keep that piece in mind, and we'll come back to it. So anyway, genealogy is simply the study of one's family tree or ancestry, just looking at your background. Let's see, and I hope you can see these slides, hopefully most of them. And genetic genealogy is that aspect of genealogy that uses DNA testing to determine the genetic relationship between individuals. So, what is this genetic genealogy? I've heard people say, okay, I'm going to do DNA, and then I won't have to research my family tree. I won't have to go to the courthouse, the dusty courthouse. I won't have to pull those dusty record books off the shelf. I can just do DNA and be done with it, and I'll know everything. Not quite. It's a powerful, powerful tool, but it is in no way a silver bullet. In other words, the results of DNA testing are one aspect of your family history, and it's another piece to use with all the other pieces that you found, all the vital records, birth records, death records, marriage records, the census records, the military records, all of those. So it's a very important step, but it's not such that you can just buy that little DNA test and be done. So what can DNA do? So you can learn about your deep ancestry. So most of us have heard of Lucy, and Lucy is the ancestral woman from East Africa that the anthropologists say was the first human being. So we know that humankind started in East Africa. And so when you do DNA testing, you can learn something about your deep ancestry. And of course, as you can imagine, everybody starting in East Africa, Kenya, that part of Tanzania. And so how did we get out of East Africa? There are those who went south into sub-Saharan Africa. There are those who went to Asia. There are those who went to Europe. And so you get these patterns of people moving around tens of thousands of years ago. And so DNA can give you a clue as to that deep ancestry. It also can tell you something about your ethnicity or admixture. And this is what apparently is very profitable. Because when Ancestry.com and 23andMe, some of the other companies, when they became publicly traded, all of a sudden, all over television, were these ads for 23andMe. This person is saying that, he thought he should be wearing a kilt, or he thought he was wearing a lederhosen, and then he ends up wearing a kilt, because, he's from Scotland, and he thought he was from Germany. And you see the black woman who's wearing a gele, tied head covering, and she says, she's so emotional. It's the most important head covering she's ever had in her life, because she's found out she's now from Nigeria. So that makes these companies money. It's not quite what it seems to be, but you can learn something about your admixture or your ethnicity. One of the important things is genealogically relevant relatives. In other words, who are your relatives that you don't know? Some of them you may know, but you can learn those through DNA testing. And of course, it's very popular these days to have adoptees trying to find their biological families doing DNA testing. And of course, non-parental events, we call them NPEs in the trade, not parent expected. And that happens a lot. I mean, who would have thought that for $99, 40 years ago, who would have thought that now somebody's going to go out and be able to buy this test and learn that the person you thought was your father all those years is not your father? So that's an NPE. And so we always caution be careful, because you may find something that's not what you expected to find. In other words, it may be a shocking result. And you'll find some family facts that you will celebrate and say, oh, wow, that's wonderful. And then you may find some that are devastating. And I actually know families that have been ripped apart by the DNA results. They may be embarrassing or may be unpleasant. You may find that your relative was a serial killer. I mean, but so I always look at the genealogist version of, the serenity prayer. And I just say, God, grant me the serenity to accept those things that I did not create, and therefore I cannot change. They are what they are. It is what it is, and you move forward. So there are some fundamental terms that I want to mention. And I don't expect you to necessarily remember this, but at least have heard it. So when we say DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, that's a long word. I don't know how many letters that is. But this is the molecule that gives bodies the genetic instructions for building and operating all living things. In human beings, it's divided into 23 pairs of what we call chromosomes. Now, double helix, have heard that. And I'm going to go back and just go back to this first slide. That's a double helix. In other words, it's simply a description of the structure of a DNA molecule that looks like two strands winding around like a twisted ladder. So just when you see that, you'll know that that's a double helix. And when we're talking about DNA, that's what we're talking about. Getting back to the terms, so a chromosome is a thread-like structure of DNA that carries the genes and transmits the hereditary information. Each human being has 23 pairs of chromosomes. There are 22 autosomes and one pair of what we call allosomes, which is the sex chromosome. So mother and father each contribute 11 pairs of autosomes. And you know that then you're familiar with, you go back to your biology class, the X and Y chromosome, and so the mother's always contributing an X. The father is contributing an X or a Y, which helps you to find out whether the child is a girl or a boy. So we always have to measure things. If you talk about how tall I am, it's in inches and feet. How much I weigh is in pounds, and I may not even want to talk about that part. But it's always a quantity. So when we talk about DNA, we're talking about centimorgans. That's the unit. So it's the unit used to measure how much DNA it is. So when we say 4,000 centimorgans, and that's going to be a very, very close relationship. 30 centimorgans is a relationship, but not so close. And so it's a measure of DNA, and it's what we all use as we look at the DNA testing. So I'll talk about haplogroup. And as we talked about Lucy in East Africa, a haplogroup is a genetic population of people who share a common ancestor. In other words, we all, humankind, go back to this Lucy, but then Lucy's daughters and Lucy's sons branched out into other parts of the world, and so we are divided into what we call haplogroups. And then just know the word genome, and this is a complete representation of a person's makeup. And I think it was somebody probably got the Nobel Prize for charting the human genome probably in the past 30 years. So why take a DNA test? Why bother to do it? So we talked about this ethnicity or admixture. And you'll see later that I've heard people say, well, I just want to know where I came from in Africa. And if you can't tell me that, I'm not interested. Well, when you think about it, you have, and we'll look at this, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8, 16, 32, 64 ad infinitum. So where did each one of those persons come from? Were they a mixture? So the concept that there's one place that you came from, you can quickly see doesn't make sense. It's illogical. As I said, it sells kits. I mean, that's what you hardly hear any DNA company advertise. Find your cousins, find your relatives. I mean, that's the serious part of this that is not so popular. But the DNA matches, finding previously unknown family. And you'll find that people who are serious family historians are looking for those DNA matches. They're really not interested so much in the admixture or ethnicity. I mean, it's interesting. And I'll show you later how my, believe it or not, admixture has changed. Now, that couldn't be, right? I am who I am same person when I was born 75 years ago. But the analysis of my admixture has changed, and we'll talk about that. So there are several types of DNA tests that are available to consumers. And the first one is the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial is material within your body that male and females both inherit from their mothers. Only the women pass it on. And so Reggie got mitochondrial from his mother, but he can't pass it on to anybody. She got mitochondrial from her mother, but she can pass it on. And so mitochondrial received by males and females, but only passed on by females. Y chromosome DNA, on the other hand, is that that's passed from father to son, to father to son, to father to son indefinitely. X chromosome material is passed down, as we said, from mothers and fathers to their offspring. The mothers always pass X. And the fathers, and this is why the father determines the gender of the child, the father passes down X or Y, determining the sex of the child. And this can have some use for genealogical purposes. But then autosomal DNA, and this is really the biggie. This is that material that's actually inherited 50% from mother and 50% from father. Most helpful at finding your recent descendants. And so we talked about those 22 pairs of autosomes. Every child gets 11 pairs from their mother and 11 pairs from their father. And for most of the testing, that's what we're going to be talking about, is the autosomal DNA. So where can you find that, and where can you buy it? So there's several companies that test autosomal DNA. You've heard of Ancestry DNA. They advertise on television. You've heard of 23andMe, and you may now have a newer understanding of why that company is called 23andMe, because it's talking about those 23 pairs. Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, Living DNA. And so you might say, well, how does this DNA test taken? So many of them are saliva swabs. In other words, they send you this big Q-tip looking thing, and you take it and you scrape the inside of your mouth and get some cells off the inside of your mouth, and you put it in a tube in solution that is provided, and you submit it. So for Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, well, actually, Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage and Living DNA, those are swabs. Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, you're actually spitting. You have a tube, and you're spitting into that tube, and there is a substance that is sent with the kit that is a preservative. And so once you have spit up to the line, and then you shake it, and you close the tube, and you send it in. And so what we usually suggest, people who are serious in the family history talk about fishing in all the ponds. Now, when you have these different companies, so Ancestry is the largest one. They have more than 20 million people have tested. And so when you tested Ancestry, that's the 20 million plus people, that's who your sample is being compared with. 23andMe maybe they have 10 million or 11 million. So when you test a 23andMe, that's who you're being compared with, but never the twain shall meet. In other words, if you test on Ancestry, you get compared with the Ancestry testers. If you test on 23andMe, you get compared with the 23andMe testers, and they don't intersect. However, there are some companies that allow you to download your results to your computer, and you're given prompts, and you can upload them to a different company. So Ancestry and 23andMe are the two that you have to test. In other words, neither of them accepts anybody else's. But on all the other companies, you can test on those too and then upload those results free or nearly free. So where can you buy a DNA test? You can buy them online from the companies on their website. You also can buy them sometimes. I think Costco at one point was selling DNA tests. I don't know whether they still are. And one of the things that you can do is both Ancestry and 23andMe can be purchased on Amazon. And so if you have Amazon Prime, you can save the $10 shipping fee. And of course, how much does a test cost in the first place? Most of the basic autosomal tests are in the neighborhood of $99, and they run samples all the time. I mean, there probably was just a St. Patrick's Day sale. There'll probably be a sale for Mother's Day. There might be one for Flag Day. I don't know. There's sales for some of everything. And so you can usually pay less and have it shipped. And now I do suggest that you be careful, because this is big business and it makes people a lot of money. So everybody wants to get in on it. And what you get is some companies with similar sounding names that are trying to make you think that they're somebody that they aren't. And so Ancestry DNA is the company, the established company. You know that a few years ago, there was a company that was promoting consumer DNA products called Ancestry by DNA. And it was a completely waste of your money. So you have to be very careful and make sure that you, there's actually on the handout, there's a listing for the International Society of Genetic Genealogists. And so these are the professionals. So you want to make sure if you have a question about a test that you talk to somebody who knows what they're doing so that you don't lose your money on something that's not valuable. And so those look-alike names or sound-alike names you want to avoid. And then you want to make sure that, what is your goal for DNA testing? And make sure that what the company promises is what you were even looking for in the first place. Because I've seen some old flowery language about what a company promises. I say, okay, so what? How does that help me? How does that advance my cause? So you want to make very sure of that. And then there is a company called AfricanAncestry.com. It's unfortunate, but I have to say to you, avoid AfricanAncestry.com. And the reason is that this is a company actually established by Dr. Rick Kittles, who is has the academic credentials, but he's making money. And for this company, they're not testing enough markers. Now, humans are much more alike than we're different. This lady and I, we may be just a small part of our bodies are different. So if we don't test all the aspects of her body and my body that are different, then it'll seem like we're the same. So if you don't test enough markers, then you aren't going to get a result that is meaningful. And unfortunately, that's what African Ancestry does not test enough markers. And so we suggest that you avoid African Ancestry. And plus, it costs hundreds of dollars, believe it or not. So who can take a DNA test? Now, we heard a lot 10, 15 years ago that only men can test. And that's because we were talking about Y chromosome, which was the father to son to father to son, and you had to have that direct line. Autosomal, everyone can test. Absolutely everybody can do autosomal DNA, and that's what 23andMe and Ancestry are selling. So only men can take Y chromosome. Men and women can take mitochondrial and X chromosome. So who should you test? And I would say test everybody that you can in your family, especially the earlier generations. And there's two reasons you want to test the earlier generations. And that is that the earlier generations retain more of the earlier DNA. Like if I am looking at Wayne, he has more Jesse DNA than his son does, because his son is diluted with his mother, if you will. So if I want to know something about the Jesse family, I'll get more from Wayne than I get from his son, and even much more than from his grandchild. So that's the reason you want to test the earlier generations. It's not the older generations necessarily, because I know some of you in here, my dear friends, that you've got children who are the age of your siblings. And so it's not so much how old you are, but which generation you are. And so, of course, the other reason to test the older generations are likely to be older. And we just know that statistically, if you've got a 90-year-old relative, we know anybody can leave this world at any time. But if you've got a 90-year-old relative, you probably want to run, not walk, to test the 90-year-old. And if you can only test 2 this week, do the 90 and the 80, and save the 60 and the 50 for later, and pray that they survive long enough for you to test them. So that's the reason. And you want to test as many family members as possible. I've heard folks say, well, I tested, I don't need my siblings to test. And so I say, well, are you and your brother identical twins? No. Well, then you have different DNA. So you get 50% of your DNA from each parent. The only children who have the same 50 are identical twins, identical triplets. And so if you, right here, you have a sister, then it's like if you threw all the DNA up in the air and just randomly caught some. You got 50% from mother, you got 50% from father. But unless you're have an identical twin or triplet, then you didn't get the same 50%. And so that's one of the reasons that folks will say, well, I'm coming up related to different people from what my sister does, so this must not be, it must be all wrong. But then the answer is, because your sister is not your identical twin, then you got some things that she didn't get, so you may test is related to somebody different. The example I always use, and some of you remember my father who left this world at age 99 and 3/4. And my daughter always says that she never knew, well, my father had a full head of hair when he left this world. I mean, full head of hair. My daughter says my father had one whole brother that she never knew an Uncle Albert with hair. I mean, the whole time she knew him, he was bald. So basically, Randolph gets whatever component of his makeup allows him to keep his hair. Albert gets the male pattern bald gene, and he doesn't have any hair. So that's just an example. Same mother, same father, and just like they got different genes as far as their hair or like thereof, then they may be related to different people. Now, I have one friend who was unable to test her parents because the parents had died before this kind of consumer testing was available. And so she has lots of siblings, and she's tested 5 siblings, and what the genetic genealogists say that if you test at least 5 siblings, because most of us don't have 5 siblings to test, but if you have 5 siblings that you can test, then just with the happenstance of it, you likely would have captured most of what the mother and the father had to offer from those 5 siblings. And like I said, what it's gotten is totally random. So I want to talk about Y chromosome and mitochondrial inheritance. I hope that you can see this and I can point it out. So here you have a boy child and a girl child. So as we talk about the Y chromosome and mitochondrial, so this boy gets his Y chromosome from his father, who gets it from the grandfather, the great-grandfather, the double great, and just on and on and on. And so, and this is the kind of thing, you've heard a lot about the Thomas Jefferson DNA and the controversy of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And so what they were looking at is to see if the Sally Hemings descendants had Jefferson Y chromosome. And so what they found is that, yes, they had Y chromosome, but the Jefferson Y chromosome, but everybody in this line has that same Y chromosome. You have no way of telling, just from that, the fact they have the same Y, whether Thomas Jefferson might have fathered Sally Hemings' children, might it have been his brother, his nephew, and all of them have the same Jefferson Y. And of course, what the historians have done is looked at when and where Thomas Jefferson traveled to Paris and when and where he took Sally Hemings. And so they used other things to conclude that in all likelihood, that Thomas Jefferson is the source of the Jefferson Y and not his nephew or uncle or somebody else. So with the mitochondrial, let me get back to getting ahead of myself here. Okay, with the mitochondrial, then this is daughter, mother, grandmother on that one line. And so you can even see from this, when we talk about just that one line, so at this point you can see 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and I keep hitting the wrong button here, let me go back. Okay, I keep hitting, okay, now the right button. 4 grandparents, 8. So if I'm able to identify what this Y chromosome line is, at this point I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 relatives in that generation. So whatever that Y gives me at this point is only 1/8 of my makeup. And then we see here it's 1/16. So you can see that that one line actually has very little meaning to your entire makeup. And so that's Y chromosome and mitochondrium. So just to show you, these are all my family members, just a whole bunch of them. That is my grandfather, and right, this 1, 2, 3 this is my great-grandfather, George Granville White, and these are 3 of his sons, 1, 2, 3, this third one being my grandfather, and this, my grandfather, this one right here, and this one are all my grandfather's brothers. And then I get into the next generation, so that these 2 right here are the sons of this guy right here, and these 2 are the sons of that one, and then my uncle, my father, anyway, all my cousins, and all of them are surname white males, and so they all have the same Y DNA. And in theory, they're supposed to have the same, and actually through a really inadvertent occurrence, we found out they did. And I'll just tell you that we were doing testing back in 2007, and we had tested my father right here, who is at that time was the oldest male in the family, and then we tested the oldest female in the family, just so that at family reunion we could, I actually took my husband to the nursing home for him to photograph my swabbing my father's, I'm planning my PowerPoint and how I'm going to do this. And so we did all that, got to family reunion, we got a result, and of course it was African ancestry, and we didn't know at the time that that really wasn't particularly valid. But anyway, so we get to family reunion, and Romney, my cousin, right here, says, oh, by the way, he did DNA testing. And he gives me something that I look at, and it's like, truly, it might have well have been Greek or Hebrew. I didn't know what it was saying. And so when I got home and looked at it, it appeared as if Randolph and Romney had different numbers. And I thought, okay, we have a potentially a problem. This is a family that's with half of our, in Canada, half here. We've been meeting in reunions for years and years and years. All this wonderful togetherness. And then it's looking like we're not together. And so we just said, oh, what do we do? So I thought, well, we have to be very strategic about this. So what we will do is we will quietly And of course, Randolph and Romney had tested with different companies. So I said, we will quietly test Randolph, because nobody will know what we're doing. We'll test him with the company that Romney tested, and we'll see what on earth is going on here. And of course, already we were saying, these guys right here, these 1, 2, 3, were born to parents who were enslaved. Their father born in King and Queen County about 1826, their mother about 1839. And it wouldn't be too surprising, I suppose, if the older child born to this young enslaved woman did not have the same father as the child born 25 or so years later when she's free and married and all that. And so we were just holding our breaths, and we talked about trying to be very strategic about this. And so, is there a lab error? And the geneticist assured us it's not likely a lab error. Is there, or what happened here? And what the experts said to us is probably not an NPE, probably not parent expected. And so we were really, really nervous. And my daughter, whose last name is Bladen White, she said, I gotta be Lauren Bladen White. I can't be Lauren Bladen Green, Lauren Bladen Brown. I mean, she is like flipping out. And anyway, the way it all ended is we found out that these two companies had reported the results in different ways. And I actually talked to Dr. Rick Kittles, the person I mentioned to you that I said don't go test with his company, but he does know what he's talking about. So I got him on the phone, and he said, if you will look at the numbers in this company's reporting, and then look at the similar numbers in the other company's reporting, you see 26 on one side, and on the other side you see 12 and 14, and they're the same. So, you know, they had the same parents, and so we were just amazed and gratified to know that. Of course, we found out that King and Queen white people, probably through no particular great feeling about black folks, but had decided that it was that Negroes did better if they were kept in family units. And so we find that in King and Queen County, Mattaponi Baptist Church was marrying enslaved black folks in the eyes of the church. Anyway, that's a discussion for another lecture. So this allows you to see so this is William Andrew White, my great-great-grandfather. I don't have his picture. And this is his son, my great-grandfather, his 3 sons, including my grandfather, and 2 of my grandfather's sons, my father and a brother of his, and then this brother's son and grandsons. So they all have the same Y. And then looking here, this is son. This is the one who migrated to Canada. 2 of his sons, and he had many. And this is William Andrew White III, 2 of his sons and 2 of his sons. So you see, this is how the distribution of the Y DNA. And you see, you can't tell by what folks look like. You cannot at all. Now this, as we look at those paths out of Africa, this is an African haplogroup. In other words, we see this haplogroup up there, EM54, it's an African group. So these are folks that went south into sub-Saharan Africa, regardless of what they look like. So this is another of my families, and that was on my father's family. This is on my mother's side, and these are just a random group of people. This is my, I keep hitting the wrong button here. This is my great-grandfather, my paternal grandmother's father, and these are 2 of his sons. And then, actually, these are 2 of his sons. That's a 3rd son. And these are grandsons, these here, of the guy in the middle. So it's a European haplogroup. Now, none of them look too European, do they? But so you can't tell. So in all probability, what we have is, at some point, a white father was involved. And, we can easily say that this was probably during the period of slavery. It could have been, but it also could have been when there were indentured servants. And before even it was even illegal in Virginia for black and white to marry, then you had people who were indentured servants in marriages. And so we don't know when they got to be European, but that male line is completely European. And that's how it is. So this is my great-grandfather's 3 sons. We do not have a picture of this guy's sons. And then here are his grandsons. And so that's how that male haplogroup passes.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Can you go back to the line? So that haplogroup R-L48, what does R-L48 mean? Is that a certain code?
Okay.
Certain
What I
number?
can tell you is if you go to the website of the International Society of Genetic Genealogists, it will give you a discussion of how geneticists have assigned these letters and numbers to certain groups. And so that's a European group. And I can't begin to tell you, but that's a European group. And you can look like you'll get to my actually female is an Asian group, but
That's
it's
what I
just a
was
set of,
Okay.
just a set of designations that they do. So these are lots of women in my family. That's my grandmother, and this is her nieces, my mother, nieces, and anyway, we go on and on through our family. And all of us have the same female haplogroup. It's been passed down. And if you get a boy in there, it doesn't work. In other words, it's mother to daughter to mother to daughter, ad infinitum. The same thing with Y was father to son to father to son. So when I organize these folk, then this is Mariah Spencer, who was born about 1845, probably in Mascot in King and Queen County. I don't have her picture. This is one of her daughters, and of course they all had lots of children. This is one of her daughters, and these are her daughters, daughters of daughters, daughters of daughters, and so on. And this is my grandmother, Mariah Spencer's daughter, my mother, my mother's daughters, and my daughter. And so that's how we're organized. We all have the same.
Can I ask a question about what you were saying, going father to son, to son, and mother to daughter? What if the mother has no daughters? Does that mean?
Well, if a mother has no daughters, she does not pass, well, she can pass on her mitochondrial to her son, but sons can't pass it on. So
Okay.
if you want to trace
So part
that,
of her
then you
DNA
need to
does not
find
pass.
somebody else in your family. In other words, if your grandmother on your father's side didn't have daughters, and you want to find that line, then you need to look at some cousins or somewhere else that you can get an unbroken female-to-female line.
Okay.
Okay.
So part of the mother's DNA does not pass because she has no daughters.
Well, she passes it. This part that we're talking about is passed to boys and girls, but the boys can't pass it on. Okay. So, and this is an Asian haplogroup. And so we wonder how that happened. What we know is that some long ago, great-great-great-grandmother came across the Bering Strait from Asia into the Americas and came down. And this group, this Asian group, is actually not, and Native Americans, indigenous people are Asian, but this is not the usual Asian group. And so I have no clue. I wish I could know. And this is, like I said, this represents Mariah Spencer. I don't have her picture. And what I see about her, it says, her marriage record says she was born in King and Queen County. But, what happened hundreds of years before, I have no idea. And I'm only hoping that maybe I'll learn. And, when you can happen to be lucky enough to have an academic working on your issue. So I got an email about a month ago from a professor at the National University of La Plata in Buenos Aires, Argentina. It's a huge university. It has like 100,000 students, 10,000 faculty, which is amazing. But anyway, he is interested in my Asian haplogroup. And he says he found me from my test results on family tree DNA, and will I share with him? And I said, tell me, I'll share anything that I can share with you. And so I'm hoping that this professor will be able to tell me something about my Asian haplogroup. And I know, who knows? I mean, it's, I'll just say that I did hear from someone, and as we talk about centimorgans being a measure of how much DNA you share with someone, that's talking about autosomal DNA, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But when you are talking about mitochondrial and why, it's a whole different terminology. So I have someone that it says we are 0 genetic distance between me and this man who lives in the DC area. So he contacts me, he's all excited. I think maybe he thought he found a sister or whatever. But I didn't know what that meant, but I kind of didn't know, I mean, I kind of knew what it didn't mean. So I look it up, and I learned that 0 genetic distance in mitochondrial means that you had a common ancestor that could have been 500 years ago, could have been 22 generations, and so it means virtually nothing for what I'm doing. But anyway, this Argentinian professor is studying it, and so if he tells me something, I'll be sure to let you know what I learned. So, autosomal heritage, and I'm going to try to move this along. So, on autosomal, as we said, you got these 22 pairs of autosomes. You're getting 11 from mother and 11 from father. And at that point, it's pretty equal. I mean, you get 50% from mother and 50% from father. Beyond that, it may not be so equal. In other words, in theory, you see that parents here, 50%, 50%, 25 from each of the 4 grandparents, 12.5 from the great-grandparents. But that's when it really, because this is random, then the 50% you can count upon. But you may have, like your 4 grandparents, in theory 25%, you may have gotten 22% from one and 28% from another. And so it becomes a very, very random thing past parents. But that's basically how autosomal inheritance works. Okay, and this is a chart that gives you the same thing we just looked at, but just potential approximate relationships, which, like I said, beyond mother and father, then is highly, highly approximate. Okay, each person, because of this, so you are losing DNA each time that you get a child born. So you get 50% of your DNA from each parent is 50% you didn't get, and then the next generation, 50%. So you are losing DNA each time that's not passed on. So what that means is you have 2 family trees, your genealogical family tree and your genetic family tree. So the genealogical family tree is just your family tree that we all know about. In other words, you put your parents, your grandparents, your great, double great, triple great, so on. So everybody who contributed to make you the person you are is in your genealogical family tree. And everybody who had a child, that got to you. But your genetic family tree only includes those that actually gave you DNA. And so let me just give you, this is your genealogical family tree. This is you, parents, grandparents, great-grands, this is everybody. But your genetic family tree is a subset of your genealogical family tree. In other words, on this illustration, only the ones that are shaded are the ones you actually got DNA from. And so if you've got a 5th great-grandmother, you may not have gotten DNA from that person. And so that is why you may not, when you're doing DNA testing, you may not show as related to somebody that is that far back or through the descendants. In fact, generally, your third cousins, pretty much, third cousins are closer. You are going to test as related. But when you get beyond third cousin, you may not test as related to them, and you may. Now, in Wayne's family, I'll talk about him. So Wayne, a number of your cousins have tested your close cousins, and I'm related to them. But on people at the very same level, I test as related to some of them and not to all of them. But it's just because the different ones got, I think a couple of your first cousins once removed have tested your mother's first cousins, and I'm related to that whole Amy Johnson crew. But some of them I test as related to and some not. And I'm probably related to half of the rest of this room as well. I just picked out Wayne. But, I'm related to Hallie, I'm related to Pat, I'm related to Annie, probably Tyler, everybody. So, just to give you some concept of the size of this is the number of ancestors you have. And I have to put my glasses on. I don't know if you can see this. But you start out with you, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8, 16, 32, 64. You have 1 million people in only 20 generations. So it's like, what can you do? You just, of course, the thing about it is you don't have that many because we get what's called pedigree collapse. Because back when there were not that many people in this country or the world, so you get the same people appearing in your family tree twice. But that's, it gets out of hand very quickly. So let's talk about the ethnicity estimates a little bit. And are they, totally fake? Is it bad science, or is it a field with limitations? And I would suggest that it is a field with limitations. So as we talk about these ethnicity estimates, and this is what the companies are selling, it makes them lots of money. In fact, as I said, we saw the difference when Ancestry became publicly traded, I guess about 12 years ago. Then, things just took off. But ethnicity estimates, what they're doing is they're comparing your DNA with DNA of people from all over the world. Now, one of the fallacies about that is, okay, so all of us are mixed, we're everything mixed. So when my African people left Africa, it was probably 300 or 400 years ago. So if they test now, look at the people who are living in present-day Nigeria, for example, then who was living in present-day Nigeria when my people left? Probably not the people who are there now. The same thing about my Europeans. My Europeans were the first ones to come to Virginia. They probably came in, well, one was in the House of Burgesses by 1630, so they came, whenever they came. And so when they left the United Kingdom, whatever it was called then, who's living where they were living then? So they're testing folks, and so that makes it, there's no way to know who was living there when your people left. People move around. All the kinds of things that have happened around the world. The Norman Conquest, all those things that made people shift, then you really can't tell. The other thing is some ethnicities are similar. And it's very hard. You have to do a lot of testing and do a lot of breakdown to tell. The other thing about African heritage is if somebody says from Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, what are those? Those are terms that Europeans came up with when they divided the African continent at the end of the 19th century. They don't have anything to do with our ethnicity. Our ethnicity may be Igbo, it may be Hausa, but it goes across those lines. And so when you're saying, okay, my folks came from Ghana, well, what is that? Are you Asante? Are you, just which group are you? And so each company makes a different estimate. And then what we find out is that the broad continental estimates tend to be fairly accurate. In other words, if you say somebody's found to be 60% African, 40% European. That's probably fairly accurate. Now, within the continents, forget it. And I'll show you, and these will be hard to see, but I want to show you how my ethnicities have changed over the years. Now, obviously, my ethnicity hasn't changed. So this is, and you probably can't see that so much, but this is on family tree DNA. And they give me ethnicities. I have to actually get up here to try to see this so I can tell you what it says. Okay, so they tell me African 70%, European 22%, and then they give me some Ashkenazi Jewish and a bunch of other stuff. And so basically it's somewhere in the 70-30 African European with variation. So that's on one company. I look at, now this is my first, this was probably, I did Ancestry DNA for the first time probably in 2014. So this is what they tell me, and what was shocking to me, and I didn't really understand at the time, is my one European line that I knew about. I knew that Richard Cauthorne came to Essex from London in 1628, but it wasn't giving me any British. And I thought, well, what is this about? I mean, this is a person I know. That's like we say we all have white people. Most of us black folks don't know who our white people are. But in this instance, I knew my white people, and it wasn't working. But what I found out is they had not done enough testing, and they had not drilled down on the different areas. And so, and this will be a little easier to read. So this is what they tell me in 2021. Now, mind you, my ethnicity hadn't changed, but they have changed their reference panel. When I first did Ancestry, they were comparing each person to about 3,000 people. That was their reference panel. Then they took the reference panel up to 10,000 people from more parts of the world. So they were able to tell you a little bit more. Now, if I look at Scotland, for instance, I think originally my Scottish was like maybe 3%. Anyway, it's 8% here, and I just looked at it yesterday, and Scotland is 12%. Okay, so I haven't changed, but you can see that they've got all those different areas they're looking at in 2023 that they weren't looking at in 2021. Yeah.
I find this really interesting that your haplogroup is Asian, and you're not showing any Asian in their description
In
of your
there.
ethnicity.
Well, the reason is that it's a different kind of testing. In other words, that haplogroup is getting you this tiny, tiny, tiny bit of your makeup that's not going to show up on autosomal DNA. In other words, autosomal DNA only goes back just a few generations. And so it's not testing, it's not going into the mitochondria of those cells, and I don't want to get too deep into them, because I lose myself if I try to get too deep into the science of it. But mitochondrial is not being tested by this. And so actually, somebody finds some Asian, but it's basically, it doesn't show up on autosomal. And it's not surprising that it doesn't. But anyway, that's how they have, and it's like most black folk from Virginia are now being reported as having a lot of Nigerian. And of course, I am, that is not impressive to me, because what is that? Is it Fulani? Is it Hausa? Is it Igbo? I mean, just saying Nigerian doesn't really mean anything. But anyway, that's
So nobody's pushing it that far?
Pardon?
No, none of these companies are pushing it that far? As in opening up the...
Not really. I mean, they're getting there. They're getting there, but let's see. So you see that they're grouping, they're doing some ethnic grouping like Cameroon, Congo, and Western Bantu. They are Southern Bantu, so they're starting to put some of the ethnic groups together, but it's really, the science is in its infancy. Yeah.
So this is relatively recent, you said,
What now? I'm sorry.
relatively recent, this breakdown, this ethnicity breakdown. that you're showing right now. So let's say Sweden and Denmark showing 2%. So how many years back is that? You know, I mean, you said it's not mitochondrial to go deep into your ancestry. This is relatively recent. So what is it looking at?
Okay,
So
this
to
is
come up with those small percentages.
Okay, so what they're looking at is they're looking at my makeup or anybody's makeup, and they're looking to see what I share with people who live in those areas today, like people in Wales. Supposedly, 4% of my makeup they're finding to be similar to people who live in Wales today. The same thing about Nigeria. They're finding this whopping 29%. And so now there is a chart that they will tell you their approximation of how far back they think it goes. And that's a whole nother thing that's beyond the scope of this talk. In other words, they'll tell you how many generations they think you have to get back to get to, the Ireland or the Mali or the Germanic Europe. So this is my heritage, and again, another company, and you see that the broad continental percentages don't vary a whole lot, and that's the part they say you can take to the bank, but just don't get into within the continents, because it's going to change, and you're going to say, well, what happened to my Asian? What happened to my, and of course it's interesting, my Ashkenazi is, I've got the 5.5% here, so my heritage is held out on that, because my heritage is located in Israel. So it may be that they know a lot more about Ashkenazi than the other companies, and so I don't know whether I have 5% Jewish or not. I mean, I'll celebrate the high holy days, who knows. Okay, now, DNA matches. And this is really the holy grail of DNA testing. This is why we do it. So DNA matches, we call them DNA cousins sometimes, and this can be a link to overcoming brick walls. In other words, just anybody who has a brick wall. But a lot of black folk have brick walls because oftentimes we can't take our families back so much beyond what we call the 1870 brick wall because some of those lines may have been enslaved. And so finding cousins, finding relatives is the important thing here. A lot of adoptees use DNA to try to find their parents. All kinds of family history discoveries. And as I said, your DNA is compared to every other person's DNA in the database. And of course, with Ancestry, they've got 20 million plus people. So, we always say start with Ancestry.com and then branch out to the others. And so when they find enough DNA, then an estimation is given as to what your relationship might be. Now, the only one that's really almost 100% sure, and I say almost, is parent and child. And I say almost because if you have identical twins, then the child of one twin is going to test as the child of the other one because the two are identical. And so,
That was just in the news, that this couple had met. The males were identical twins, and the girls were identical twins.
Mm-hmm.
And they met at a twins conference.
Mm-hmm.
And they got married, and they each had twins as children. And so their children were siblings as well.
Genetically.
Yeah, genetically,
Right.
as well as, or cousins.
Right, they were siblings genetically, right. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, that's actually what is so important about DNA matches. So I'll talk a little bit, just moving through this, about, you test with these companies, and then there are all kinds of third-party tools that help you do this. And now, probably 50 years down the road, you'll just be able to plug in the centimorgans and get all the answers, but we're not at that point. And so gedmatch.com is one of those websites, and it's mostly free. You can pay $10 a month and get enhanced use of the website. DNA Painter is another one, and this one is so important. I'll talk about it in a minute, in that it gives you allows you to map your chromosomes, and that's really beyond the scope of this talk, but allows you to see what you actually share with somebody. Like, do Pat and I share, 15 centimorgans on chromosome 3? Or do I share with Hallie Jean on chromosome 4? Or, we all share. But anyway, those are some of the tools, and on the handout are the links to those. So this is one of these very important tools. And so what you do is, there's yourself, and this is, it's on your sheet so you can go to this. It's a chart that tells you what the range is. In other words, for aunt and uncle and niece and nephew. Maybe the range in terms of centimorgans shared may be from 1,200 centimorgans to 2,000 centimorgans. And so you can look at, and there, except for parent and child, there are relationships that have the same approximate amount of DNA. In other words, you share the approximate same amount of DNA with your grandchild as you do with your aunt or uncle. And so you have to look and see if it's 1,600, then it could be your niece, it could be your grandchild you don't know about, or it even could be a half-sibling. So you have to look and see and then evaluate. And of course, some of it is looking at age, and we know that, generations, the ages can blur, but you're not going to have somebody 3 generations from you that's the same age. That's not going to happen. But those are some of the tools. So just wanted to show you some of my DNA matches. And I don't know whether you can see this. I don't know how much you can, but these are some of my relatives. In other words, this is when you go to your ancestry page, this is how your relatives are displayed. So this is my uncle, and then you see, and you probably can't see that, but that says half uncle. And I have amended that because actually what it said was close family to first cousin. There was a range because they can't tell you exactly what it is, but it happens to be the uncle I've known all my life, and he's my half uncle. He was thought to be my half uncle, of course, because my grandmother was dead long before he was born. And so DNA shows that he's the half uncle I thought he was. And this is a first cousin once removed. In other words, that's my father's first cousin. This is my half first cousin because her father is was whole brother to this uncle of mine, and they're all my father's half siblings. So Karen and Wanda are my half first cousins. Orrin, who, by the way, plays for San Francisco and didn't make the Super Bowl this time. I have to do that little piece that everybody in my family is disappointed about. But anyway, he plays for San Francisco. And so he is listed as a half first cousin once removed because he's my half first cousin's child, so he's 1 generation removed. And then this is Chris White, who is actually my second cousin once removed, because although younger than I am, in large families, his grandfather that we looked at on another slide, who's the one who went to Canada, was the youngest of the family, and my great-grandfather was the oldest. And so although he's younger than I am, he's a different generation. And of course, what makes it so cool for our family is because of the differences, then the Canadians in our family who are roughly my age, and I'm kind of in the middle of them, some are a little older than me and some are a little younger, they are my father's generation, and they're still living. So that means that we get to test all of them and get 1 generation. So in my father's generation, there are 4 or 5 people left in this country, but there are dozens in Canada, and so we get a chance to test them, and so that's pretty cool. So suppose I did not know who my uncle was, and sometimes you don't. So I think it says 681 centimorgans. So suppose I didn't know, and I had to try to figure out who this was. So I would go to this chart, and I would put in the number of centimorgans, and then it will tell me what the possibilities are as to what that person could be. And then I can do my usual detective work to try to figure it out if I did not already know who he was. And the cool thing, yeah.
How do you get to this?
Pardon?
How would we get to this?
On your handout, there is a URL for DNA Painter shared centimorgan chart. And I tell you, if anybody wants us to send you this, because it's so much easier if you have it as a link. So if you will give Marilyn your email address, we will send you this, and then you'll have a link, and you won't have to try to type in all the numbers. But it's really cool. This is interactive, and so it tells you, the possibilities, 97% chance that it could be all those things. And then it actually grays out. See, this chart, let me go back. That's what it looked like, just as it is. But when you put in a number, then it actually grays out what it can't be and leaves lit or illuminated what it can be. So then you can do your detective work and look at all those possibilities for what that relationship could be. And you'll see that half uncle is right in the middle of that. Of course, I happen to know, but there are some people that you don't know who they are. So this is an unknown match, and I asked her permission because, there are some privacy issues we talk about. And so I asked Kate's permission to share this with you today, and she said that I could. And so this is an unknown match. Her name is Kate Woodward, and already that may sound familiar to some of you. And it says she's on my father's side, and so Ancestry can, most of the time, they can tell you, without your parents testing, they can tell you whether it's your mother's side or your father's side most of the time. So this person is on my father's side, and so I don't know much about her. But she has a tree, and she has a family tree on Ancestry. So when I look at her family tree, look at who she is. Can you see that name? Philemon T. Woodward. Okay, Marilyn, tell them who that is. So Tyler, tell everybody who that is.
You can see his portrait right over here.
Which one is his?
Right here, Philemon T. Woodward. He was clerk.
This one?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, he was clerk in Middlesex during the Civil War, and he's the one who saved all of the county's records.
So he's like a folk hero. He's the person credited with saving Middlesex County records when during the Civil War. So that's Philemon T. Woodward. And Kate, see, this is Kate Private, her parents, grandparents, her great-grand. So Philemon T. Woodward is her double great-grandfather. So how am I related to Kate? And we have been working on this and working on that. And it'd be so easy for me to say, oh, I'm related to Philemon T. Woodward. Well, no, I'm not. What we can tell is that it's on her Pollard side. And so you'll see that here she's got a Woodward married a Pollard. And you see that Pollard is in green. And what they do is, I've got Pollards in my tree, and Kate's got Pollards in her tree, and so they will highlight in green common surnames. And so what I know, and she and I are fairly substantially related. What I do know is that my great-great-grandmother, Rachel Pollard, was enslaved by a Colonel Pollard in King and Queen County. And so it seems like she was more than enslaved by him. So Kate and I have been trying to figure out whether Colonel Pollard himself, and he was born, I think, about 1803 and died in 1877, is Colonel Pollard the father of my great-great-grandmother, Rachel Pollard, or is it one of Colonel Pollard's sons or somebody in his family? But I'm related to all these white Pollards. And then we even have oral history that in the early 20th century, white Pollards from King and Queen County would go to South Jersey and visit my grandmother's sister and they'd stay and have family visits and whatever. So we haven't figured it out yet, but Kate and I are working on it. In fact, she sent me just yesterday some information about a book about the Negro, entitled The Negro Servant, or something like that, that one of the pilots had written early in the 20th century. So I've got to find, well, on World Catalog, I can find that book and see if I get anything that helps us to figure out how Kate and I related. And she's got a 91-year-old uncle that she's talking to, and we just really haven't made too much progress yet, but we share all these relatives, and it's all around Pilot and King and Queen County.
Is she the same generation as you?
Yeah, well, I don't know that. So, Ancestry gives you theories, hints. You know, they used to advertise the shaky leaf hints. And when you get those shaky leaves, it's a theory that their computer has generated. Now, whether that theory is accurate, you still have to do your homework. You cannot accept the theory. So Ancestry thinks that Colonel Pollard is the common ancestor, and here's my great-great Rachel Pollard, who had Betty Ross, who had Bessie Montague, who had Randolph White, who had me. And what they think is on this side, Colonel Pollard also had Mary, who married the Woodward, who had William, who had Fletcher, who had Dr. Woodward, who had Kate. So they think we're the same. Their computer thinks we're the same generation. But so that makes us, you know, fourth cousins, because we know we got a half in there. In other words, we don't have, to the extent that Colonel Pollard or somebody like him is the father of my ancestor, potentially Rachel. Rachel, we know it's not a whole relationship. It's a half somewhere in there. And so that's their theory, and we're working on it. And some of this, quite frankly, you'll never figure out. And of course, you have thousands of DNA relatives, thousands of them. You know, this one attracted my attention because of this man right here. He got my attention. But, you know, most of it you'll never figure out. Some of it you will. So you can see from this, now this is another one, and I'm going to wind this down. But all I'm going to say about this is somebody, and this is how Ancestry does it. It's fourth to sixth cousin, and they feel it's on my mother's side. So if you will look at this person's tree, okay, here he is, private because he's, you know, living, and his father, private. Look what it says for his grandfather. It says Robert Kennedy died in 1968. I thought, okay, is that the Robert Kennedy who died in 1968? So then I look here, and I see this name, Rausch. And remember Sheila Rausch Kennedy's just scandalous book when her husband, this person who's represented right here, decided that after 12 years of marriage and twin boys, that he's going to divorce her and, well, actually not divorce her, have the marriage annulled so that he can remarry in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And Sheila said, she fought all the way to the Vatican, and he was unable to do it. So that's who this is. So Matthew Kennedy, my cousin, one of the twins, that he didn't even bother to do half of a tree. But I can tell who he is because I know Sheila Rausch. I mean, we all know from her book. So he doesn't even put on this tree. So he's got Sheila's father, but not her mother. So what do? In fact, I ignored it for a while because finding out my relationship to Matthew Kennedy was not exactly one of my biggest priorities in life. So I really didn't deal with it much. I never really thought that it was on the Kennedy side because I figured that, you know, they were Boston and, you know, all of that. And I knew that Ethel was a scapegoat from the Midwest. I really didn't think that. But when I started to get more and more matches that I shared with the young man, and I said, let me pay attention to this. So when I started to research and see people do DNA, and they don't do a tree for themselves, so, or do half a tree like this. So if you want to find out how you're related to them, you may have to research and start a tree. So I've done a tree for Matthew Kennedy. So what I found out is that the grandmother here, Sheila Rauch Kennedy's mother, that he didn't even put on his tree, these are folks, wealthy folk from the main, Philadelphia's main line, you know, Ardmore, Bryn Mawr, that area. And so I started to research them, and I get them back to Richmond, Virginia. But then I keep going and find that Matthew's fourth great-grandmother came from King and Queen County, Virginia. So, okay, we're getting there. Because, of course, 3 of my 4 grandparents are from King and Queen. But then we run into the lost records. King and Queen records burned in April of 1864. So I'm unable to even establish the parents of Sheila Rauch Kennedy's 4th great-grandmother. So it's somewhere in King and Queen. And what can I say? And again, I worked on it for a while, not exactly one of my priorities. I'm probably much more interested in trying to figure out some of my African ancestry that was cut off by slavery. So, Cousins Explained, real quick, and this is a sheet you have. You can see that it's really necessary, if you want to figure out these relatives, you've got to understand Cousins Explained. You've got to know that your first cousin's child is not your second cousin. And my mother, the griot and ever the genealogist, would get so upset when somebody said that their first cousin's child was their second cousin. I mean, she ran up her blood pressure. So first cousins have 2 of the same grandparents. In other words, siblings' children. Second cousins are siblings' grandchildren. Third cousins, on. So if you've only got one common grandparent, like in the instance of my half-cousins, they're the children of my half-uncles. So they are my half-first cousins. Their children are my half-first cousins, 1 generation removed. Now, we had a new baby, Kathy, I don't know if you've heard this, born at 2 o'clock this morning.
Oh, did you?
Andreas had the second baby. So that baby born to my first cousin, my half-first cousin once removed, is my half-first cousin twice removed. And they didn't even have a name yet.
Baby is, or Andreas is?
Andreas, second baby. You know, she had this is the second pandemic baby. So things are moving on. But anyway, so once removed is just a generation removed. So this is on your sheet. And my husband whenever I started talking about this, his eyes would glaze over. But when we finally made it mathematical, then he said, okay, I can deal with this. But it's on your sheet. But you've got to be able to master this as you're trying, if you've got a DNA match, and you're trying to figure out how you're related to someone, you've got to understand the cousin relationship, because otherwise, you won't figure it out.
Along these lines, what do you call your grandmother's sister?
Your grandmother's sister, now that is your great aunt or your grand aunt. And that
Yeah,
is,
see, I go crazy when they say grandmother, because
Pardon?
it doesn't match the generation.
speak up.
If you call it a great aunt, it doesn't match the generation. It's your grandmother, so it should be your grandaunt.
Well, that is something that is a big discussion in the genealogy community. And, you know, I won't say there's many different ways as there are genealogists. There's 2 different ways, and people come down on it differently. And I don't know that there's that there is a right way and wrong way. You know, most of us just call it the great aunt, but it could be the grand aunt.
Well, the difference being,
Quick question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Mhm.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out these first cousin, second cousin.
Okay.
Uncle Jack is your half uncle.
He's my half uncle. That's right. My father's half brother. Andy is my half first cousin because he's the half uncle's son.
Andy is Jared and Andrew are your
Half first cousins once removed, 1 generation removed. In other words, they are the children of my half first cousin, so they're half first cousins once removed. So this baby just born is the half first cousin twice removed because it's 2 generations.
Phew. All right, so I always wonder what, when you hear people saying once removed, that's kind of reminded me of somebody you want to get rid of. But I have a couple of those. Okay, so now that makes sense because you and Andy don't have the same great-grandparents.
Well, no, we don't have the same grandparents.
Grandparents.
Right, we don't have the same grandparents, so our fathers are half brothers
Mhm.
because they had different mothers.
Right.
So we are then half first cousins.
Okay, gotcha.
And you got to know that because otherwise, when you start to play with this chart, it's going to come out all wrong if you don't
Yeah, I
have
can
that
really boggle
understanding.
your mind because some of my cousin Frank, his child is not my second cousin.
What is he to you?
He's my first cousin.
No, his child is not your second cousin.
Not my second cousin, he's my first cousin.
Cousin once removed.
removed. Yeah,
And his
you know
grandchild is your first cousin twice removed.
that. Okay, and then his mother,
Is your aunt, right?
not really, she's my cousin. I'll call you and talk to you. about
Okay, we'll talk about that one.
It's
Okay.
like,
I was gonna say, the reason is that you're all between the aunt and the great aunt. Your aunt is your, say, your mother's sister.
Okay.
So when you go to the grandmother, they can't be an aunt because your mother's siblings are your aunt and uncle. So your
So let me kind of say what you're saying so other people can hear. So you're saying, okay, you got your mother's sister is your aunt, right?
Right, so you have to go to great aunt when you get to the next generation.
Well, it's just, the question is what you call it. It's whether you call it a great aunt or a grand aunt. And that's I mean, we know it's the next generation, but the question is just, what's the terminology?
It's just a matter of how you pronounce it.
Right, it's a matter
Whether
of,
it's aunt or aunt.
right. Okay, so we're going to finish this. This is just a chart. We can send it to you that does the same kind of thing. And then I'll just run through. This is a chart, and we can make this available, that you just put in here who is the recent common ancestor that you know about, and then you just go this way and that way, and then whenever you get to is where the 2 lines meet is what that relationship is. And this is one I filled out, and I know you can't see this, but this goes back to Elizabeth Warner and John Lewis, who were the persons at Warner Hall in Gloucester, old Virginia landed gentry. And what I've done is I've gone this way down to my cousin Steve Greaves, and this is his daughter. And then I've gone this way down to me, my daughter, and then I come down, and so Steve's daughter, and I have to go around here to see this. So Steve's daughter, Dakota, and my daughter are 8th cousins once removed. But Steve, who's there, and I are 8th cousins. And so, oh no, that's Steve and my daughter are 8th cousins, and Steve and I are 7th cousins once removed. But, and Steve
You're
and I are
related to
about
my
the same.
husband. You're related to my husband.
Really?
Yes. I'll have to tell him.
Warner?
Yes.
Okay.
His family's in the book. I'll get to you the names so you can figure out where you are in the chart.
Okay, so yeah, well, half of us related. I think that John Warner and Elizabeth Warner Lewis must have hundreds and hundreds of descendants. And when you think about how many descendants they had, how many tested, which was a fraction, and then how many of those we test as, it's a lot of them.
It's mind-boggling, isn't
And
it?
I'm related to Bob Montague's sister, Mary Breck's wife, is descended from them as well. So it's half of Middlesex and Gloucester and Essex and whatever.
Well, he was in North Carolina. So it was so weird when we moved here, and after we left here and went back to Newport News down, we discovered that he was from here.
Well,
So it's like, wow.
all roads lead back to Virginia.
I guess
And
so.
unless your family just got here, whether it's your African family or your European family, unless you just got here in the past couple of hundred years, you're gonna end up back in Virginia. and you're going to end up in Eastern Virginia because this is where everything started. So it's not surprising. Okay, so this is just kind of funny. And I want to read this if you can see it. So this is Albert Einstein. And so he says, that would make my second cousin once removed, the great aunt of my first cousin twice removed. No, wait, that can't be right. So he goes on to deal with relativity and says that this is too complicated. He's not going to deal with it.
I like the bottom of it.
So, quickly, just a few things, some innovations. Suppose you can't get spit. You need, and so if you have an elderly person, a person is infirm, a child, you can't get them to spit, and you want to do a test. What do? Go to the University of YouTube. There's a YouTube video that tells you how to create artificial saliva. And actually, what you're doing is you're taking a saline solution and you are taking these little swabs and you're scraping the inside of your jaw and you're soaking it in the saline solution. And actually, I have one colleague who's so bright, and some of you know him. I'm talking about Michael Patricia. He was able to do this by himself. Some of us are not that bright. So my college roommate and I needed to do her sister who's infirm. So it took both of us. I went to Petersburg, and it's like one of us is watching the YouTube video for the 5th time, and the other one's doing it, and we still got it wrong, but it came out okay. We were able to get her DNA done that way. And so that is kind of a way that, because I know some folks who was my mother's last first cousin, and she was on her last. She couldn't spit. So what her children did was they did family tree DNA, which was a swab, and so wished that they could have gotten the saliva, but we didn't know about the artificial saliva at that time. Artifact testing is something that is really in its infancy. Can you test hair? Can you test that envelope that somebody licked 60 years ago? It's really in its infancy. In fact, just this week, the New York Times had an article on Beethoven's hair. Did you see that? And some of the samples, it's like when he was dying, all the samples of hair were cut, and one ended up being a Jewish woman, so that was not the one. Anyway, they're looking at what he died from and all of that. But it is really a developing, so hold on to those artifacts. At one point, they used to say that if you had a hair sample, that you couldn't do anything with it unless you had the root of the hair. In other words, if you had a piece that was cut, then you needed the actual base to get the mitochondria and the like. And so that seems to be changing.
Yeah, Beethoven's was the end.
Pardon?
Beethoven's testing was on the end.
Yes, they have found out how to test. They don't need the root of the hair. So, just a few things. Remember that the relationship estimates are estimates. Don't try to take them to the bank. Analyze them for what they are. All of these companies have messaging ways of getting in contact with folk. And so if you test, make sure you check back. You know, I've seen folks, you send them a message on Ancestry and you hear from them, if at all, 3 years later when they happen to check back, or they registered under a different email address and they never see that message. So keep checking. And all of these companies provide all kinds of tools to help you. It's a developing science, and so there are more tools now than there were 6 months ago and a year ago, so keep checking back. Take advantage of so many classes offered, many of them virtual, many of them free. You can learn so much, just take the time to do it. And then there's such a huge community of folks who are interested in doing this, and this is on your handout, some of the Facebook groups that are people that you really can learn from who are doing this kind of work. And then finally, ethical concerns. There are some folk who don't want to do DNA because they say the government will get my DNA, and I don't know what they think the government's going to do with it, but they won't test the DNA for that reason. They think that it's somehow going to be used against them for some type of insurance consideration or whatever. That has never personally been a concern of mine, but when you are, and I actually managed the DNA for about 40 people, mostly relatives, but some friends. And so just make sure that when somebody entrusts you to manage their DNA, just make sure that they understand what they are giving you. Now, forensic DNA, there was so much PR when, remember, the Golden State Killer was apprehended. Old, cold case DNA. And what they did was they had the DNA from the victim. And years later, they plugged that DNA into GEDmatch, which is one of those third-party sites we talked about. And they're able to work backwards and work forward and come up with the man. And some folks were all, they were totally, they'd taken their DNA off of GEDmatch. And my position was, if somebody connected to me as a serial killer, then, have at them. I don't have a problem with it at all. And so GEDmatch had to actually give you an option. There's an opt-out if you don't want to be a part of any forensic deliberation. That's up to you. I actually got an email about 3 weeks ago that's from something called the DNA Doe Project. And this is a national project that is seeking to identify victims. So there was someone, a young woman, found, and she had been strangled, found in the fall of 1967 in Michigan, somewhere in Michigan that I can't think of the town, but it's a place that you never heard of. You didn't know that it was. Ottawa, Michigan, that's what it was. It's like, okay, it's at Ottawa, Michigan. But anyway, and that person is related to a 93-year-old cousin of mine whose DNA that I manage. And so the question was, will you share this person's DNA? So the first thing I did was call my cousin Juanita and explain to her what this is about. And before I could finish, she said, by all means. So she was only too happy to share her DNA if it can help this DNA Doe project find. If you will Google Jenny Doe, you will see what's the picture of this really attractive young woman who was thought to be maybe in her late 20s in 1967 when her body was found. And they are trying to work through and figure out her identity. And my cousin is a tailor from King and Queen County, and the Jenny Doe doesn't seem to be related to any of the other surname White family members who've tested. So maybe it's on her tailor side, but we don't know yet. But, I'll let you know. I'll be really anxious to find that out. And then, of course, what happens when you find out that somebody is a half-sibling to who they thought they were a whole sibling to? What do you do? And it really becomes an ethical consideration. I've had it happen twice. In one instance, when I learned that this cousin, who was supposed to be double first cousins to somebody, in other words, two sisters married two brothers, and they were supposed to be double first cousins, when I finally figured out, because I had seen a lot of DNA matches from the Northern Neck, like Westmoreland and Richmond County, and I thought, what is this? But I hadn't paid too much attention because it wasn't, my primary purpose. And finally, it occurred to me, no, she is not her mother's husband's child. And at that point, this person was 80-some years old. She was in a nursing home on her last, and I could not communicate it to her. So, of course, my responsibility would have been to talk to her before anybody else. Then she died. And her children really have shown no interest whatsoever. So at such time as they may show interest, then now that she is deceased, I will let them know and share with them what I have another instance when I tested 3 family members, 2 sisters and a brother. The sisters are whole sisters. The brother is a half. And he's the youngest child. And he's not my cousin. because I'm on the father's side. And at this point, 2 of the siblings are deceased. Again, there are lots of younger people in the family who've shown no interest, but if they look at it at all, I mean, if you just look at it all, you see, large number of centimorgans shared by the whole sisters, and then a much smaller amount shared by the brother who's a half. And it's a situation where I don't know whether, these folk knew that or whether they didn't know it, but anyway. So many issues with this DNA testing. Imagine sperm and egg donors from 40 years ago who were promised that they would be anonymous. And now all of a sudden there's this $99 or less test that, and of course there's a group of sperm donor babies. It's about 40 of them. And they are half siblings, all from the same young man who donated his sperm as a way to make money when he was in medical school. So, all kinds of results. So I want to end this. I think we are at the end, and any questions that I might try to respond to.
You know, in Middlesex County and King and Queen, there's a lot of Asians. They're Indians. Because when I took the test, when it first came out, they had Asian, then they had Native American. That was the person, because I got it for a present, for a bunch of us. And they had, but my great-grandmother, she was Indian. So that's where the Asian came in at.
Okay, I'm not sure of the question, but yes, indigenous people are Asian. And what is the question?
I said, that's where Middlesex County and King and Queen came in. There were a lot of Native American Indians at the time and everything. That's where the Asian came in,
Well, there were a lot of, as we talk about not knowing the history of black folk in Middlesex County, I mean, it's like the indigenous people got wiped from the slavery. I mean, it's criminal how little we know about that part of our heritage. Any other questions, comments?
I did my DNA through 23andMe, and my whole life, I guess there's been this little cultural element of Native American ancestry, Mingo Indian. And I even have the name of the ancestor from the last quarter of the 18th century. I know a lot about him, but mine came back with, I think I'm about 3% African and 0 Native American. And my question is, if my sisters test, I have whole sisters, and they come up with Native American, there's like a part of me that still feels like a poser or something because I thought I was Native American.
Well, you and the sister are not identical twins.
Right.
So you got different DNA from both the same parents. You got you different. And so just like going back to my father and his brother and the male pattern baldness gene or not, then one whole brother got it, one didn't. One of you got this little piece of native, the other didn't. As you were dropping off 50% each time, you got a different 50 from your mother, a different 50 from your father, and so that's
well,
why.
they haven't tested yet, so I'm anxious to do that, but if they both come up with 0 Native American, I mean, I guess it's just as likely that maybe it was some, the Plecker laws in 1924.
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah.
One is that, well, for us, we know that what Dr. Plecker did as chief of vital records, he wanted to make everybody black or white. So he took all those folk from Central Point, where Essex, King and Queen and Caroline come together, all those Charles City folks, and he made them Negroes, when many of them were native. And so aside from his following, there are any number of reasons that can happen. And one of the reasons is the reality is that indigenous people in Virginia didn't mind mixing with white folks. They really didn't. And so many of those folks on the reservation are whiter than people off the reservation, which is why not many of them test, but they don't really want to talk about that. The other piece is that if you have, and this is kind of, all this descended from Pocahontas kind of, rosy picture. You get black folk who said, or what you'll hear from black folks is, grandma had high cheekbones, long, straight black hair, and she was native. You hear from white folks, they were descended from Pocahontas and whatever. And in large part, you have white people who would rather be connected to natives than connected to black folks, so they didn't tell that story right. And then you have black folk who wanted to be exotic. And then what you have in my husband's family, his great-great-grandmother, yeah, 2 greats, is said to have been native. Okay, so most of this family looks straight from West Africa, but you can't tell by looks. So he, in some instances, on some platforms, tests as about 2% native. One aunt tests as 5%, and one aunt doesn't. But suppose that great-great-grandmother, who was said to be native, suppose she was 1/4 native. Because, you can see how they say, oh, she's native. So by the time it gets down to you, then it's no wonder that it doesn't show up. And then, of course, because fewer indigenous people test, then because all of these are comparisons to reference populations, then you just don't get a good comparison. So, but most folk, in fact, Henry Louis Gates says that his family in West Virginia is mad with him now because he said that no, we are not Native American, and it's not showing up, and because they don't want to believe that. But there are all kinds of reasons that it might not show up.
The quick comment. Certainly I don't look Native American. But actually my dentist told me, it's very odd. My dentist told me it's very odd as being an African American, your teeth are shaped like Indian, Native American teeth. And after he got his hand out of my mouth, he had a tendency to ask me stuff while he had his hand in my mouth. And we have been told that my maternal grandmother is part Indian, but then the West apparently came from West India. So it's like this whole mixture, and all that's left are my teeth.
That could well be. That could well be. I don't know what kind of teeth indigenous people have, but if you look back at how many ancestors you have, you can very quickly see that, I don't know if you remember.
So that way you can.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. I don't know if you remember that at a point Oprah Winfrey was saying, well, she thought she was Igbo and she was Zulu or whatever. Well, how can you say that you are any one thing when you have all those ancestors, so many, many ancestors that now, some populations tend to, like a lot of Jewish people, tend to marry and stay within their communities, which is why we can have an Atunati population that's fairly distinct. But most folks aren't like that. Most folks cross all kinds of ethnic boundaries, and so you are just a grand and glorious mixture, and all of us are.
I thought it was interesting what you said about the brothers and the male pattern baldness, because I've always heard that if your father, the man's father, had full head of hair, he would. But when I think about my father and two of my uncles, my father was in the middle of these 3 brothers, and the older one and the younger one both had that male pattern baldness, but my father had a full head of hair to the day he died. So after what you said, I understand that.
Well, we see that because whereas I didn't test my father, when I look at the amount of DNA that I share with the half uncle and all the rest of the family, then I do know that, in fact, my father and my uncle have the same father. And so it's just, DNA is amazing. It really is. Any other questions? We've been a very long time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bessida. We appreciate everybody coming, and
Do you
we
have
look
that
forward
sign-up
to.
sheet? The sign-up sheet?
Yes, I have it. I'll give it to you.
And
And
if we
always,
put our emails on it, she'll send us those charts.
correct, yeah, we'll get them off to you. Yes. So let us know and check our website, that kind of thing. And this is, Kevin Gentry graciously has recorded this. Very, very kind of him.